I want to emphasize this one. Who should adapt to whom? Because this is one of the videos. So you'll remember, like, I ask, and I've done that in many workshops, okay? I've asked Canadians, like people in many different kinds of organizations. Oh, actually, I should mention that a little bit. So, kind of, my clients tend to be corporations, like for-profit organizations, like accounting firms, oil and gas companies, mining companies, banks, insurance, like usually large organizations. Just because if it's a small organization, we do one workshop, we're done. Okay, so I end up working mostly with large organizations. I work a lot with government as an employer. What I mean by that is, like for example, the city of Calgary is one of my clients. I've worked with the city of Edmonton, city of Toronto, Durham region, York region, city of Hamilton, and so on. I work a lot with colleges and universities. So all across Canada and the world. And usually there I work with MBA programs, like when students arrive, and I work also extensively with staff and faculty, helping them understand the mindset of foreign students. I work a lot, I used to, now I work a lot less, with regulatory bodies, like CPA Alberta. That's why we're here. Thank you. Again, thank you. And I've worked a lot, like in Ontario, the regulatory bodies I've grouped together into an association called the Ontario Regulators for Access Consortium. And so that is one organization I've worked with. Through that organization, I've worked with many different regulatory bodies. And finally, I work a lot with immigrant servicing agencies. So these are the 5, when I talk about my clients, these are the 5 categories of organizations I typically work with. So in many, many workshops, I have asked people that question, who should adapt to whom? Now, if you ask the question straight like this to a group of Canadians, the answer you're likely to get is everybody will need to make some effort, but some will need to make more effort than others. Very true, not all that specific. So in order to get something more concrete, I ask people, okay, let's say this bar represents the gap we have to bridge between newcomers and Canadians. What percentage of the adaptation should each group make? So in Canada, you generally speaking get 80-20. It's a very, very common answer. You can reach consensus on that answer fairly readily. Most immigrants will say, I chose to come to Canada, I will need to make the bulk of the adaptation. Some help would be nice. And most Canadians are willing to make some effort. I cannot recall anybody born and raised in Canada who said it should be 100-0. All right? This answer is cultural. In other countries, for example, in the US, it's going to be 95-5. Used to be 90-10 before the 2016 election, but now it's 95-5. In Western Europe, it's 99-1 or 98-2. In China, Japan, or Korea, the concept of adaptation does not exist. So there's no percentage. I'll never be Chinese. I'll never be Korean. I'll never be Japanese. Okay, you are or you're not. So the reason I bring this one up here is today's workshop is this. There is one group that will from time to time say 50-50, and that's people in the not-for-profit sector. Many people in the not-for-profit sector want to help. That's why they got into that sector. And so in their mind, Canadians should do a bigger percentage of the adaptation. There is one challenge with that approach. Why is 50-50 unrealistic? Can anybody think of? Anyone? Yes? Anybody? I know you have, if I ask you to use, yes, go ahead. If I'll ask you to use this thing, I know it sounds really intimidating. Yeah, well, that's all right. We'll manage.
I guess, in my perspective, would be for newcomers, they have to, once they come to Canada, they have to adjust their living habits, yes. Right? So that's make a huge of 30% already.
Yes. So, yes, you have to adapt in so many different ways. Absolutely. There's one fundamental thing in my experience. I learned the Canadian language, English. So 50-50 means Canadians will learn my language. Will Canadians learn the languages of all immigrants? that makes absolutely no sense at all. The other thing is, what do you adapt to? Because there's so many different kinds of immigrants, because we don't all come from the same place. And like, how do you adapt? Like, what do you adapt to? So the idea of 50-50 sounds wonderful in theory, and I hear it from time to time, okay? But it is unrealistic in practice. There's another very important point. It is that, in my experience, immigrants need to make the first step. I need to make an effort. People, I find most Canadians will be more than happy to help me adapt if they see me make an effort. But if they don't, they're less likely to help me. And that is an important point for many of your clients, because when they first arrive, that element can be, people may expect more help than they're getting. It may be because they're not showing the effort they're making. There's another important point, because I get that less in Calgary than in Toronto, but in Toronto or Vancouver, you will often hear people say, well, I don't know if in Vancouver they've reached quite that point, but in Toronto they've definitely passed that point. More than 50% of the people in Toronto are immigrants. Like, immigrants are the majority of the population in Toronto proper. Yeah? So people will say, and I've heard some immigrants say, well, now we're the majority, they need to adapt to us. Sounds great, but why? Yes?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
By definition, what is the concept of immigrant? When you talk about Toronto, there are more than 50% population immigrant. Many people has been immigrant since 18s.
No, okay. So
that's in the concept, or in the time being. There are many definitions about that.
So, sorry, I'm being French. I'm jumping in before you finished asking your question. So, fundamentally, my definition of an immigrant is somebody who was, so in the context of today's workshop, is somebody who was born outside of Canada. So, yes, there's many people who are descendants of immigrants, but they're not, by my definition today, they're not immigrant themselves. Okay? And the other thing is, you're asking a good question, because my definition of Canadian for the purpose of the workshop will not be somebody who has a Canadian passport or somebody who was born in Canada. My definition of Canadian will be somebody who did their high school studies in Canada. Okay? Why is that? Fundamentally, it is for the following reasons. The high school years, the teenage years, are the most formative years of your life. This is when we become social beings. Does any of you have teenage kids? Yeah? What do teenage children want to do?
They want to be part of the peers.
Exactly. They want to be like their friends. They want to sound like their friend. They want to look like their friend. They want to behave like their friend. Okay? So when we're teenagers, that's the time of life when the environment has a huge impact on us. And this is why our accents get formed during teenagers. If a kid comes to Canada before the age of 12 and goes through the Canadian educational system, by the time they're 20, they will sound like a Canadian because their accent will be like the average Canadian, and they will have learned to think like a Canadian from a professional perspective. Again, today and tomorrow is all about the workplace. What happens at home, I cannot comment. Okay, that is not a part I studied extensively. But the workplace is the part that I have studied. And if I take the very simple example, my stepson, so Caroline and I got married like in our 40s, because for both of us it's a second marriage. So Caroline has a son from her first marriage. His name is David. David came to Canada, he was 6 years old. Did not speak a word of English when he arrived. He's 6, no English whatsoever. Okay? So the first report card he got in grade 1 was, does not participate enough. Yeah, no wonder. Okay? Now, he's a very extroverted person, and by the time in one term he had learned English, so the third report card he got in grade 1 was participates too much. Okay, so it's kind of one of these things. So, but David is now 24. He went through the entire educational system in Canada. He did his bachelor's of computer science at McGill University. Now he works for Amazon Robotics in Boston. And professionally, he's learned to think and behave and communicate like Canadians. Okay? So my definition of Canadian will be somebody who did their high school years in Canada. By that definition, I'm not Canadian. I am a Canadian citizen. I consider myself Canadian, but I know that whenever I encounter a situation that I have never encountered before, my first reaction will be French. And I'll tell you, it's not an uplifting story, but it's true. This is exactly the moment I realized that no matter what happens, my first reflex when I encounter a situation I've never encountered before will be French, is this one. So I told you I'm married to Caroline. That's my second wife, as I mentioned. My first wife was from Montreal. Her first name was Diane. Unfortunately, Diane died of cancer, and so I got remarried. When Diane died, I obviously have to organize the funerals. And I have no idea how to organize a funeral, because that's the first time I have to do that in my entire life. Actually, I've never been to a funeral in Canada. By that point, I had never been to a funeral in Canada. And I will always remember, so we're in the kitchen, my mother-in-law and I are discussing, what are we going to do, kind of thing. And my first reaction was, well, we'll do the wake in the house. You know what I mean by the wake, right? You're going to get the body and my mother-in-law, who is a fairly mild-mannered person, she had such an intense reaction that I realized, oh my God, I've crossed a big line here. Okay? Her reaction was, there's no way we're going to do the wake in the funeral home. And the intensity of her reaction told me, okay, this is going to be a disaster if I try to do it my way. So I told her, you organize, I pay. This way it will be done the Canadian way. The other thing I told my relatives, please don't come. Okay? I asked my French relatives not to come because I knew if one of them, if they came, there would be a moment during the funerals where it will not be done the French way, and they will tell me about it. And usually, I'm sure if you've worked with French people can be quite direct. And they would tell me directly in front of 100 people, I would not have the emotional intelligence at that point to manage the situation. I would be in a lose-lose situation. And I had a 45-minute conversation with one of my cousins, where I kept telling her, please don't come, and she kept insisting she's going to come. And after 45 minutes, I told her, the reason I don't want you to come is because I don't want to have the same conversation in front of 100 Canadians. You understand where I'm coming from? So this is why I'm going to use the definition of Canadians, people who have gone through high school in Canada, because professionally, this is when we learn so many of the skills that are so important in the workplace. We learn to make presentations. I mean, we start way earlier, but this is when we really practice extensively. We learn teamwork. We learn project management. We learn all these skills that are so important in the workplace. And so where you were in the world at that moment when you learned all those skills will impact very much what you learn to do. Okay? So in Toronto, the percentage of people born, so I'll use the Stats Canada definition of immigrant, people born outside of Canada, period. The number in Toronto, the number of people born outside of Canada is 55% of the population of Toronto, something like this. So some immigrants will say, well, now they have to adapt to us. Why is that not the case? What's missing in that equation? Well, it's the relative influence on society. What I mean by that is, if you think of, again, we're talking about the workplace, right? Okay? If you think of any organization, who defines the culture of the organization? Who creates it and who makes it evolve? Senior leaders. These are the ones who, I'm sure you've heard the golden rule, right? Do unto others what you want them to do unto you. Has any of you heard of the second golden rule? Do you know what I mean by that? The second golden rule is whoever has the gold makes the rules. And there is some of that. Fundamentally, if you think about all the large Canadian organizations, banks, insurance, accounting firms, power companies, oil and gas companies, mining companies, whatever. Who is at the top of these organizations? Yeah. I will be even more specific. So if you can use that thing. White, male Canadians who speak English usually as first language, quite often as the only language in English Canada. In Quebec, they will be French speaking. There are some immigrants who, in those top levels, most of them come from the UK, South Africa, Australia, the US. Okay?
English speaking.
English speaking, exactly. Okay? I mean, if you look at accounting firms, it's really striking.
Yeah.
In accounting firms, if you look at the partners, the vast majority of partners are white men, straight, able-bodied, whole 9 yards, okay? And virtually all of them speak English as a first language. And they set the rules. They set the culture of the organization. So this is why, in my experience as an immigrant, I need to understand the unwritten rules of Canadian organizations, okay? In order to succeed, in order to integrate. And as you've seen in the video, one very important point is that the gap is way bigger than most people realize. That is really a big challenge. And this is an important point. Why? So if you're a counselor, it's important to realize, why do most newcomers underestimate how big of a difference there is between them and the average Canadian professional? So yeah, if you can use, let's use this gizmo.
Okay, newcomers have, right now they have departure orientations and all.
Yeah.
But it's not enough to really prepare them.
Yes.
The way Canada promotes immigration outside Canada is different from in the inside. The promotion of the immigration is very different.
So we're going to come back to that point about how, essentially, because you're getting to one fundamental point. Why do immigrants have an incomplete or inaccurate view of what life will be like when they arrive in Canada?
They have preconceived ideas already.
Yeah.
That was put to them during the process of the immigration.
So we're going to talk about how it happened, because that what put to them means they received.
Yes.
And they're an actor as much as they're a receiver. So we'll talk, that's why we'll talk about this one. That is definitely part of it, okay? There's one other very important point. Most immigrants who come to Canada today under the skilled immigrant category, right? That's the biggest one. If you come through the skilled immigrant category, what does it mean? You have
You have to have money.
You have to have money. Yeah, you have to save money. And there's one more important than that money. You have to have education. You have to have a high level of education. You need at least a bachelor's in most cases. Okay. Now, do you know what percentage of the world's population has a bachelor or more? You know, think about the 7 billion or whatever it is that we are human beings on the planet. What percentage of that population?
Small percentage.
Yes.
Very small.
It's 4% roughly. But that is a global average. That percentage is obviously higher in a country like Canada. I don't know what it is, but it is significantly higher than... Actually, Canada is one of the countries that has the highest percentage of people with bachelor's or more. There's a good part of it is our immigration system. We choose immigrants based on their education, and so we get educated immigrants, and that brings the average up. And it is a fact that the percentage of recent immigrants, like people who have arrived in the last 5 years, who have a bachelor's or more of education, is higher than the general population in Canada. Yeah, but I do. Yeah.
28.5% in Canada have a bachelor's.
That's it. So 28.5% versus 4% in the global population. So what does that mean? So if you are in the home countries of immigrants, so what are the home countries of immigrants? I'm sure you all know, what are the top countries of immigration to Canada today? Yes?
China.
So, yeah, China, India, Pakistan is high. The Philippines is the top one. Iran, Nigeria, these are the countries where people come from. So more generally, it's going to be Asia, Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe. These are the parts of the world where people come from. And in those parts of the world, if you have a bachelor's or more, what social position does that give you? Very high social position. Okay? You are automatically part of the top 4% of the population. And so what happens is this. For many immigrants back home, having a bachelor's means you're part of the elite, more or less, and you are very different from the average person in your country. People expect that when they come to Canada, they will essentially find the same structure, meaning I have a bachelor. When I meet someone else who has a bachelor, we will be alike. But here what happens? That is not the case. Number one, the percentage of people who have a bachelor is way higher. So you're not nearly as unusual, if I can put it that way. And the other thing is, we are an egalitarian society. And what is the consequence of that? Well, the difference between the rate at which intellectual work is paid and the rate at which manual labor is paid is very different in the home countries of immigrants, where there's far less difference in Canada. Very simple example. I mean, I'll take a number of engineering examples because that's my background, obviously. Yeah, but I mean, we'll use other examples from other professions as well. In Canada, a senior engineering technician or technologist may make more money than a junior engineer. I'm not saying all of them do, but the good ones definitely do. If you're a good technician, you will make more money than a junior engineer. That concept makes absolutely no sense in the home countries of immigrants. In most of the home countries of immigrants, a junior engineer will make 1.5 to 2 times the salary of a senior technician. Everybody with me on this? So what does it mean? Well, I have a bachelor's. When I expect that when I meet other people with bachelors in Canada, we will be alike. And the reality is, no, we won't be alike. Because here you will be 1 in a million, as opposed to the unusual one. And that makes a world of difference. So people have expectations about what life will be like, and we're going to come back to that point extensively, which unfortunately do not bear out. That's not the way it is. But people don't know, and they don't know they don't know. So many immigrants, many newcomers underestimate how big a gap there is between their home country and Canada. And many Canadians also, go ahead. Yes, please. Yes, please pass it around. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I think they also underestimate the amount of time it's going to take to find relevant employment.
We're going to get to that point right after this.
Yes,
you are absolutely right, and we will expand on that, absolutely. So what ends up happening is many newcomers, underestimating how big the gap is, at some point end up in the situation where I feel I've done my part. I feel I've adapted enough. Yeah. And Canadians will feel the same way at some point. And the reality is, no, there's still a huge gap, but people don't know, and they don't know they don't know. And so what I want to do during today and tomorrow is we're going to focus on this part, the part that the average immigrant is unaware of. the average Canadian is also unaware of. But by and large, who's going to have to bridge that gap? Well, like newcomers will have to make the bulk of the adaptation there. Okay. So as you've heard me say in the video, to me, the most effective approach is this. As a newcomer, I need to learn the unwritten rules of Canadian organizations and follow them. Okay? For that, it's really nice if people help me and explain to me the rules and give me feedback. Because I don't know if any of you has tried to figure out the rules of a game by watching people play it. It is not easy. It sure is a lot easier if somebody who knows how the game is played explains to you how the game is played, the rules of that game. So this is the relative importance of technical skills and soft skills. So technical skills is very obvious. Soft skills, I define that as the combination of 3 sets of skills: managing relationships, managing yourself, managing the system. And technical skills and soft skills are independent. Some people have great technical skills, poor soft skills, or the reverse. Canadian organizations will usually place you on a scale like this, and as you know, most immigrants will end up in the top left corner when arriving. Why high technical skills? Because, well, that's the way you get accepted. Why poor soft skills? Because soft skills are measured by cultural standards. That point is really important in my experience for immigrants and foreign students to understand. You may have had great soft skills in your home country, but you have to relearn those soft skills here. The good thing is, typically, so what I found is typically if people had high soft skills by their home country standards, they will drop like everybody else. But they are far more likely to improve on their soft skills than people who had poor soft skills in their home country in the first place. Because they can understand the concepts and they can see the value of it. Whereas people who have poor soft skills to start with don't even understand the concept in the first place. Okay? So, if you remember the video, one really important element is the relative weights that we place on technical skills and soft skills. It depends on your job. Some jobs are way more technical than others, or more like emphasize soft skills more than others. But if I do the average of all professional jobs in Canada, I find that the relative weights will be roughly 50-50. We tend to weigh technical skills and soft skills approximately equally in Canada. This is a big deal. So, number one, what it means is lines of equal value will be like this, meaning anybody along this line brings the same value as the person in the top left corner. The big thing is that in the home countries of most immigrants, since these countries are hierarchical, there what matters is technical skills. So I tell people the weights are 90-10. Some people will say 80-20. I won't quibble. It doesn't matter. Like there's no meaningful difference between 90-10 and 80-20 in this case. The key part is the weight on technical skills is much higher. And that is something most people will readily accept. So it's very obvious to most immigrants that back home, technical skills matter a lot. How high a degree did you get? Which university did you get that degree from? Make a world of difference. On the other hand, soft skills that are far more valued in Canada are not nearly as emphasized in their home country. And the example I use usually is presentations. Because Canadian kids start making presentations very early on and keep doing that throughout their education, whereas in most of the home countries of immigrants, you may do it once before you graduate from high school, but that's about it. Okay, you don't do it very frequently. With 90-10, lines of equal value end up being almost flat. Here, if I lose 1 unit on the technical skill scale, I will need 1 additional unit on the soft skill scale since the weights are equal, -1 + 1. Here, if I lose 1 unit on this technical skill scale, I'm going to need 9 more units on the soft skill scale to compensate because the weight is so low on soft skills. So this is the reason so many immigrants get so frustrated throughout their careers, and in particular during their job search. It goes like this. Candidate A is competing for a job or promotion with candidate B. So candidate A is an immigrant, high technical skills, poor soft skills by Canadian standards. B is somebody born and raised in Canada, or another immigrant who's been here longer. If A and B are competing for the same job or the same promotion, who gets it? So the full answer is it depends which criteria the people who make the evaluation use. If we use Canadian criteria, meaning egalitarian, then B brings more value than A to the organization. And in Canada, you have far more organizations using these criteria than these one. It does happen, we'll come back to that point, but most Canadian organizations will obviously use Canadian criteria. So by Canadian criteria, B brings more value than A. How does A interpret the situation? It's unfair, it's discrimination. Because by my standards, I bring more value than that person. The challenge is, yes, by your standards, but that's not the standards that the people who make the determination as to who brings the most value are using. And that is, remember when we talked about, the ability to see the world in shades of gray? If people cannot see that there's different ways of evaluating performance, then at that point, the person will be really in a bind. Okay? If you've seen the video, I experienced this. Okay? When I was at Procter & Gamble, I competed with a guy for a promotion. I have a PhD, he has a bachelor's. No technicians wanted to report to me because of the way I give negative feedback, which was French. That's straightforward. He was very popular. No sandwich. Okay. Oh my God. Where the average Canadian will say, oh, it's a good report, you may want to look at section 3 some more, but overall good work. I said, redo section 3, it's wrong.
It's pretty harsh.
Well, the message is the same. You need to work more on section 3. But it was delivered so differently that no technician wanted to report to me. And that is this is what I mean by poor soft skills by Canadian standards. My soft skills were very good by French standards, not by Canadian standards. So candidate A will think it's discrimination. And that is a big challenge. Because if people start thinking discrimination is the root cause of the problem, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's no discrimination in Canada. Okay, it certainly happens. No, that's not my point. In most cases, at that point, it's not the issue. The issue is really just how you communicate, how you behave, how you think does not match the expectation of the people on the recruiting side or on the evaluation side. Okay? But we'll come back to that point. So if the person thinks that discrimination is the issue and keeps focusing on discrimination, what happens? If somebody goes to a job interview expecting to be discriminated against, what do you think is likely to happen? Yeah, they're going to see it. They will find it. So in other words, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you look for discrimination, in essence, you go in with a negative attitude, the person will respond to that, will essentially have a negative response, and you will be justified. The problem is you're still the one unemployed. Okay. So again, I'm not suggesting there is no discrimination in Canada. It certainly happens. But by and large, the problem is if you start focusing on that, because how much impact do you have on that? We come back to that sense of ownership. Coco, if you can use the that thingy, yes?
Oh, I just want to share little small things because sometimes when you're actually talking with other people, other immigrants, in a Canadian way of trying to make the things sounds nicer, right?
Yes.
But then delivering the idea to them, sometimes some people just don't get it.
Yes.
So you have to be direct to them.
Very true.
Sometimes. Yes.
Yes. Yes. The way I will coach a French person will be different from the way I coach a Canadian person. Yes. On average. Yeah. That's very true. Yes. Sometimes you have to be very direct. Look, it is not going to work. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So, in the typical situation, B, Canadian organization, B gets the job, A thinks it's discrimination, and that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a big challenge. Now, there's one special case. It's Canadian subsidiaries of global companies that have their headquarters in hierarchical cultures. What do I mean by that? Well, think Sinopec Canada, PetroChina Canada, Sinuk Canada, Huawei Canada, Total Canada, Repsol Canada, what else? All Tenaris Canada, these all companies that have their headquarters in other countries that have a strong sense of hierarchy, and they have a Canadian subsidiary. And in the Canadian subsidiary, you will end up with a number of expatriates. And between A and B, who will expatriates prefer? Exactly. Particularly if A speaks the same first language as they do, there's a really good chance they're going to prefer A. And at that point, B will be the person who feels it's discrimination. And I can tell you, I see that all the time. Okay? But the outcome is the same. Somebody feels discriminated when in fact the real issue in most cases is people don't understand how their performance is measured. And that is a critical element. Now, this is where like MBA programs, for example, become really useful. Because by going through some form of studies in Canada, people will learn how their performance will be measured in a Canadian context. But you'll notice they're not learning technical skills at that point. They're learning more on the soft skill side. And we'll come back to that point again tomorrow. Is everybody with me on this one? Because this is a big deal. Because the common reaction of most immigrants at this point is what? There's three very common reactions. One is, I'm going to complain. Who does the average immigrant complain to? Other immigrants who come from the same country I come from.
Sometimes they're a career advisor.
Yes, very true. That does happen. Okay, but you understand what I mean. Like the first line of is people who come from the same country I come from. I'm French. I complain to the French people. I'm Chinese. I complain to other Chinese people. Does that help me? No. It feels wonderful. Why does it feel wonderful? Well, people will validate your feelings, your interpretation. And people get into the blind leading the blind. And so one piece of advice I give every immigrant, and I encourage you to give it to your clients, is do not limit your socialization to people who come from the same country you come from. Right?
My daughter said that to me.
Yeah.
When we have a celebration, and my daughters tell me all the time, Mom, we have been living here for years, and your set of friends are still Filipinos.
Yes.
That is so sad. That's what she said to me.
She has a point.
Yeah. She said that to me after 5 years.
Yeah.
After 5 years of her living here. That's what she said. I said like, huh? Yeah. Embrace other culture. Be friends with others. I know it's hard, but it's going to be much richer.
Exactly.
And you learn that from the kids.
Exactly. Well, your kids are in the system. And their class looks like, I'm sure the class picture of your daughter looks like the United Nations.
Yes.
And so that is the part that people will learn to meet people from all over the world. Now, there's a bit of a caveat, because I can see it with my daughter's friends and my son's friends. The picture looks like the United Nations. But all these, I was going to call them kids, I'm showing my age here. They all go through the educational system in Canada, which means they're Canadian. Okay? They will be hyphenated Canadian. Some people will use that word. I'm sure you've heard, you know what I mean by that. Okay? But by and large, professionally, they will have learned to think the Canadian way. And I can tell you, when they go overseas, now they have challenges. When they go, well, it's a bit of a personal story here, but last summer, like my daughter, I went to France with my daughter, my son, and my daughter's boyfriend. And he thought, cultural differences, no problem. After a week and a half, he left.
Wow.
Yeah, he just couldn't hack it anymore. Yeah. So, and their relationship has ended. But you understand the point, okay? Like, I mean, like, people, like, and the children of immigrants will grow up in Canada. They will, quite often, they will speak the language of their parents. In Canada, they do. In the US, they don't, in most cases. Okay? In Canada, they will. But at the same time, their understanding of what it's like to work in the country their parents come from will be very limited. They will understand how to live there in a family context, because they will go there quite often, or they will be part of family reunions here and so on. So they will know what to do in a family context. But in a work context, it would be very different. But we'll leave that aside. That's kind of, we're not talking about that form of immigration. Yeah. So one situation is people will complain to people who come from the same country they come from. It feels wonderful, but people get into the blind leading the blind. Okay. Another very common reaction, and that one, if you work in a college or university, it's very obvious. People go back to college or university to get a higher degree.
Yeah. Or the same degree they had, but the Canadian
version. Exactly.
Yeah.
Does that help them?
Not particularly.
It really depends on how they study, in my experience.
Yeah.
If they study the way they would have studied back home, which is trying to get as high a GPA as possible, then that doesn't work. They will be back to square one after they graduate in many, many cases. If, on the other hand, they study in Canada with the idea of learning soft skills, creating a network, being active in the student association, all kinds of things that don't improve your GPA, actually will bring it down, but you're going to work on your soft skills, then it can make a world of difference. But again, people may not know, and they may not know, they don't know. Yeah. The third reaction, which if you're looking for a job does not apply, but if you have a job already, you may have seen people like that. People feel it's unfair. They didn't get the promotion they deserve, so they go into another organization. And I've seen people keep changing organization, thinking that, well, it's not fair, when in reality the issue is they don't understand what's going on. And it's an interaction problem. It's not they, it's us.